What's up, everyone? Okay, today wanted to talk about Monsanto. What are they doing? What happened with the trial? Why did they lose the case? Who was Dwayne Johnson? Why are we in the mess that we're in? Now, some of you may be saying, especially guys down south, you're probably not hearing what the guys in the Midwest and the Northeast are hearing. Now, you start moving into the plain states, Kansas, where Roundup ready crops are all over the place. Roundup is kind of a way of life. There, you're not going to get a whole lot of pushback because that is the economic capital of Roundup use. Whereas in the South, too, you've got Roundup ready soybean and corn now. Again, same thing, you're not seeing a lot of pushback from there. But guys in the Northeast that aren't exposed to the level of agriculture that we are here in the South, they're getting a lot of pushback regarding glyphosate. So today, let's talk about and ask the question, is Monsanto really trying to kill us? So if you haven't seen it, I did a really long written article about this, and this is something that you can send to someone who is big time anti-glyphosate, anti-Monsanto, and I'll go ahead and preface this right now. I do not think Monsanto is ethical as a company. There's a lot of questionable decisions they make regarding their Roundup Ready seed and seed development, and I understand they have to protect their own developments and stuff. However, a lot of their offtake agreements that they use as a business tactic is a little bit questionable. So I guess I'll go ahead and start with Dwayne Johnson. Dwayne Johnson worked for the school system in California. He was an integrated pest manager, and really what that meant was that he was a chemical applicator. Now, as far as being a chemical applicator, the one responsibility he had was spraying glyphosate 4 months out of the year, doing vegetation management on multiple different schools throughout his area of California. Now, as an applicator in the testimony, he was described not only by himself, but as by his co-workers as a model employee. He described how he prepared for every day. He wore a Tyvek suit every day to mix concentrate. He wore chemical resistant gloves. He wore long sleeves, long pants underneath. He wore chemical resistant boots. He washed all of his clothes separately from the rest of his clothes. He did everything by the book. Exactly. You could not have asked for a better applicator in terms of his precision in handling the material. In fact, I'll say Dwayne was such a good applicator that he carried his label in his pocket at all times. And regardless of the fact that I'm sure he had memorized the label many times over, he and his co-workers verified that he checked the label every time he mixed material. You can't ask for a more dedicated and better technician. In fact, that is the epitome of what we need more of in this industry. What I'm getting at is that Dwayne Johnson was a model employee. He was a model applicator. He is just a great human being. So even though Dwayne Johnson took all these precautions to limit his exposure to the chemicals he was applying, he said that the majority of the time when he applied, he faced blowback or drift that would get on his face around his face mask. He did wear a face mask, so he wasn't inhaling it, but it was getting on his face. Also, there were two specific instances. One pre-cancer where the hose on his hose reel, where the hose bar connected to the actual hose itself, it blew right there and was shooting material up into the air. He had to run, cut off the machine, and in fact, this is again what a great applicator it is. He dug a trench to contain the spill in dirt and keep it from running down a hill. That was pre-cancer. The second instance was after he had began exhibiting symptoms of cancer, in fact had already been diagnosed. He had a backpack begin to leak. He only used the backpack a couple of times. One of the few times he did, it began to leak and was running down his back to the point where he felt like it penetrated his Tyvek suit. So he had daily exposure for the 4 months out of the year that he sprayed to the face. He had one exposure where his hose reel blew, and then he had another post-cancer where it actually dripped on his back. This video is not going to be pointing blame at Dwayne Johnson. In fact, absolutely the opposite. Dwayne Johnson, again, I cannot stress enough, is the model applicator. What happened to Dwayne Johnson and the development of cancer is terrible. Cancer affects everybody, every race, creed, religion, no matter where you are, what you do, everyone has been affected by it in some form or another. And what happened to Mr. Johnson is terrible. It's absolutely awful. You cannot take that away from him. It is something that he will have to live with, and unfortunately, it may be something that takes his life. It is not to be taken lightly. Mr. Johnson is suffering horribly as a result of his cancer. So that being said, let's jump into a few details of the case. Pre-trial, when the lawsuit was first started, pre-trial they had in discovery showed testimony or potential testimony or a line of questioning that occurs with expert witnesses to the judge to see if that testimony would be allowed if it went to trial. The judge said, yes, absolutely. It can be admissible in court, and we would allow them to testify. However, the judge also said that the evidence and presentation of fact from the expert witnesses came across as shaky. It went to trial. The trial was 16 days of testimony. The start of the trial was emotionally charged, and I'll give you an example. One of the things that came up was the fact that Monsanto was the same company that manufactured Agent Orange. For those of you that don't know, Agent Orange was an herbicide that was utilized in the Vietnam War. It also was a horrible, horrible herbicide. It was a combination of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. They were both synthetic auxins that they were spraying on the jungles in Vietnam. Not only did it affect generations of Vietnamese, it affected generations and still continues to affect generations of U.S. soldiers. And the effects are devastating. If you've never known anyone that is suffering from the effects of it, it's terrible. And the reason why people were affected by it was a byproduct of the 2,4,5-T manufacturing process called dioxin. Dioxin was a powerful poison that ended up taking many, many, many lives, U.S. and foreign. So immediately in the trial open, that was a topic that was brought up. This is Monsanto. This is the same company that manufactured Agent Orange. They're alluding to the fact, why couldn't they produce another product like Agent Orange and hide it from the general public? That's the emotional charge that went into this. As we move from the opening statements actually into the charge, there are a couple of expert witnesses that are brought forth. There's two in particular. One of them is Christopher Portier. He is one who actually worked on the IARC report that stated glyphosate was a probable carcinogen. Let me go back a little bit and talk about this. The entire suit, the entire argument against Monsanto is that they really leveraged this report by the IARC. It was, partially funded, or it was a part of the World Health Organization report. They determined using their set of data that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen. They didn't. Now, there's different classifications. One of them could be that it's not a carcinogen, or it could be a known carcinogen. It could fall into one of, I think, 3 or 4 categories. This one fell into a probable carcinogen. So again, this is the whole basis, the whole foundation for the lawsuit against Monsanto. Christopher Portier, he was a consultant on the IARC report. A lot of questionable things happened when that IARC report was formulated. Let me give you kind of a brief synopsis of what that was. So the IARC has a preamble that outlines the methodologies that they use to determine their results. The IARC has never really been brought into question for their methodologies. Everybody's just kind of taking it, but again, IARC has never really tackled an issue as large as, say, glyphosate, the most prevalent herbicide used in the world. It dives a little deeper than just the IARC. So the part that gets a little sketchy prior to the IARC report. First, the IARC met for 1 day. They had 1 day to analyze all the data to be able to come up with their results. And they relied on a lot of pre-done information that were done by different scientists. And one of those was Christopher Portier. Now, what was not evidently clear is that Portier may have been under contract with another defense team prior to his reporting to IARC his findings. Let me talk a little bit about his findings. Portier says that in his findings, he discovered mice that had contracted non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from exposure to glyphosate that was overlooked in all the other reports that were done, specifically the ones by the EPA and the follow-up ones by the BFR and the European councils. And he submitted his issue and the lack of finding or the overlooking of the data that showed these mice with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, submitted it in a letter to say, you know, basically y'all made a giant mistake, you need to reanalyze this. So they did reanalyze it, and they sent another response that said, well, yeah, we looked at it, and your analysis of the data is incorrect. Portier had kind of a reputation of continuing to do this. He would go down the list of whoever had done a research or data set or data collection about glyphosate and sent them a letter dissecting their testing procedures and saying, this is where you made your mistakes. You made several different mistakes. Under cross-examination, it became more clear that Portier was doing that, and the way he was drawing his conclusion that people were making mistakes was because they disagreed with his analysis procedure. And what came out was that Portier was actually taking bits and pieces of information from each different test and using that to draw his conclusions. So where you may have a data set that exists of, we'll say like 1,000 different animals. And if you ran the statistics based on those 1,000 animals and you came up with a result of 0, what Portier would do was he would create classifications for the animals. So we'll say like skin color, sex, length of tail, whatever, and then analyze each individual data set. And if there was a correlation between the two, he would say that that correlation is a causation. So I think we need to come to a definition here of causation and correlation. So again, he was drawing correlations between the existence of NHL, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and the prevalence in mice based on certain detailed parameters within the data set instead of looking at the data set as a whole. So, for instance, a causation would be when it rains, things begin to turn green. So the rain is going to supply water. The water works its way to the plant. It's going to solubilize nutrients that exist in the soil to be taken up by the plant. It turns it green. Okay, so a correlation would be like when the sun comes up, people begin to fall down. Well, kind of. So if you think about how that correlates, the sun comes up, people wake up, they begin walking around, you're going to have a higher instance of people falling on the sheer fact that people are up and walking around. That is a correlation, not a causation. It's not a direct influence on what's causing people to fall. It just correlates because sun's up, people are up, their circadian rhythm says to wake up, more people are moving, there's higher instances of people falling. So in that, there are certain techniques that are used to, when you begin to break apart data sets like that, you have to utilize things like p-values to take into account false positives among correlations to determine causations. And unfortunately for Portier, what he did not do, and again, this is according to the rest of the world science organizations that have looked at this, Portier did not employ the proper corrective actions to his p-values to take into account multiple data sets. Multiple test sites require corrections to account for false positives. He did not apply them. And then, interestingly, the next expert witness, it got even more intense on the science front. So he's an epidemiologist, and what they do is, they study trends and statistics. They're like a statistic scientist in the medical field. And again, it was a lot of the same thing where, he was questionably employed by the defense team by the time he began releasing arguments against glyphosate. Not that that actually had an influence. It may have, it may not. But again, a lot of his epidemiological practices or techniques that he employed to come up with the answers he came up with, a lot of that was based on a lack of corrective actions to account for false positives. As you dove deeper and deeper into the argument that was taking place between the plaintiff and the defendant, in this case, Dwayne Johnson's the plaintiff and defendant is Monsanto, they were building more of this conspiracy case that Monsanto was out, kind of to get the world to deceive the scientific community. What kind of popped holes in that theory was that these scientists all had great working relationships with the scientists who formulated and released the agricultural report that took a certain data set. In fact, this was the longest running human exposure cohort study that had ever been conducted. It began back in the 90s with 50,000 participants. They followed up in the late 90s and again in the 2000s. And with any kind of large scale like that, it's going to be hard to track 100% of the people, right? But still, they still had over 30,000 people a decade into the study still answering questions. And one of the interesting things they found is that universally, across the board, everybody's exposure went up, climbed significantly. However, not everybody's. The rate of cancer was still equal with the population taken into account the exposure to glyphosate. So there was no direct contributable causation of glyphosate leading to an increase in cancer. Otherwise, with the rate of exposure that the group of 30,000 people increased, there would be a trend in the increase in certain cancers or just cancer in general. And that didn't exist. That was Monsanto's quote-unquote smoking gun. And the expert witnesses for Dwayne Johnson's team said that these are all credible scientists. But again, they said that these scientists did not analyze the data correctly. So for 8 days that went on, 8 grueling, brutal days of really intense scientific discussion. At the end of 8 days, the direction of the trial shifted. It shifted from a focus on the science to a focus on how cancer impacted Dwayne Johnson's life. And it was devastating. It was awful. I mean, he's losing everything. His ability to, be with his kids. His kids are trying to be supportive, and it's a terrible, awful, horrible thing that could not have happened to a better human being. And I think that is what makes this that much more painful, is that Mr. Johnson is such a high quality, productive member of society. And he is suffering and will suffer, unfortunately, maybe to death, and lose years of time and laughter and love with his family. He's having to sacrifice all of that because of this cancer. However, after those 8 days of science, there was no more real talk of the science until the closing arguments. And the closing arguments kind of read the same way, where Monsanto was saying what we need to focus on is the science, and what Mr. Johnson's team was saying is that clearly Monsanto is out to get us, and the proof is right here in Mr. Johnson living this horrible end days of his life. The emotional charge was so high, I personally believe, was the result. We saw $290 million judgment against Monsanto. Now, if we, kind of dissecting the result and trial of this, the potential influence Monsanto could have, Monsanto profits around $14 billion a year. That's a significant amount of money, but we're talking about the agricultural community. Agriculture is one of the largest markets, economic factions of the United States, and really of the world. U.S. agriculture is the largest player in the world. So $14 billion in the scale at which they operate is not the amount of money it would take to be able to overpower the scientific community as a whole, especially on a worldwide scale. In the same vein, Monsanto has questionable history in their past. Now, a lot of the stuff that existed with the ghostwriting arguments that came out against them, apparently a lot of that is actually really common, not just in the chemical industry, but in the food industry. And it's what I've learned a little bit about the research side of this is that all research that comes through university is paid for by somebody. And typically it's a manufacturer that pays for it because it's the manufacturer that wants their product tested. And so to cut costs is that if you have a team of scientists, you will have a team of scientists write and then give it to the university to review. Now, a lot of the data collection and data sampling that takes place has to be done by the university. A lot of times you'll have graduate assistants and so on and so forth handling all that. But in terms of actual data collection, that's handled by the university. It's just the scientists in-house that begin to write, and then it's reviewed by the university. So there's still a check and balance system there. Now, on the other scientific front would be how everything played out with IARC. So after IARC released that statement saying glyphosate was a probable carcinogen, they then backtracked on their entire preamble. And it was very bizarre in the way they did. One, they changed the way that they analyzed their data. It almost came across, reading the new changes in the preamble, was that, this is only our opinion. It should be further analyzed past our findings. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and say that you're going to see articles in the news like the one about how our children's cereals contain glyphosate. And I'll give you a little bit of backstory on that. That is based off a little bit of an extension of Prop 65 in California. The EPA recommends a maximum of 140 milligrams per kilogram of body weight in adults. According to Prop 65, they recommend 1.45 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. The EWG article that wrote this, they have their own set of testing parameters, and that was 0.01, so it was 100 times less than California, and you're looking at 0.01 milligrams per kilogram of body weight in adults. And even at California Prop 65's level, what was present in cereal passed Prop 65. So we're talking about 100x decrease than what the EPA estimates as a maximum allowable tolerance. We're talking about 1,000 times less that this company EWG is attempting to employ and say that they're in violation of law. Well, no, they're not. They're violating EWG's law, which is at 0.01 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, almost zero, effectively. I mean, that's a very minute, insignificant amount. So when you see that, it's important that we have to apply a little bit of logic and reasoning when it goes into this. You know, science is science. In epidemiological studies, there's a bit of objectivity that goes into it that can be influenced by personal opinion. And there's certain procedures and techniques that have to be used when analyzing the data set. And then also a little bit of human logic to be also applied. And what I'm getting at is that there needs to be a distinction between the emotional impact and the actual data impact. What happened in this trial is that emotion beat science. Science says glyphosate is safe. The emotional intensity of this trial said what happened to Dwayne Johnson was a terrible thing. Science says glyphosate is safe. It is the most tested herbicide in the world, and consistently it comes out clean. It's important as applicators that we keep in our mind that as time goes on, we're going to run into more and more instances of us choosing to use a certain chemical to control a certain pest, whether that be a weed or a bug, and a customer is going to say that we injured them physically. And we have to be armed with science when this does happen. We have to justify, one, the product that we used. Two, the product we use will actually control the pest that we say it will. Three, we applied it at the right time, temperature, wind conditions. And four, we got the desired kill that we expected to get. My fear is when emotion begins to defeat science. What happens to us when we make a decision based on science, but it ultimately doesn't matter because it's the emotion that's going to make or break or be the ultimate determining cause in a trial. Keep that in mind. So everybody, in the link down below, I've got the more in-depth write-up. Check it out. Share it with a friend. Share it with someone who is against glyphosate. Let them read it. Let them look at it. There are trial transcripts in it. Let them read through the trial transcripts. Let them digest the information and see what kind of argument they come up with. Again, we have to keep a barrier between the emotion and the science. Science says glyphosate is safe. Cancer will always be a terrible thing. Glyphosate is not going to kill us.